So this lecture is on the endocrine system, and I will divide this system up into 3 separate videos to keep them a little bit shorter. Also look for questions embedded within the PowerPoint. So first of all, the introduction to the endocrine system. The endocrine system is made up of different cells and tissues that produce hormones, and hormones are chemical messengers. What that means is that they are chemicals that are released into the body fluids, mainly the blood, and they travel throughout the body. These chemicals then coordinate and control body processes, things like reproductive cycles, like growth of tissues, and we'll talk about many other different examples as we go through. So first of all, how do cells communicate? Now we're going to look at different types of intercellular communication, and by intercellular we mean between different cells. So the first mechanism is called direct communication, and this happens when ions from one cell move directly across the cell membrane through gap junctions within the membrane to an adjacent cell. So this can happen between cells of the same type. It is very specialized type of communication, and it doesn't happen very often. The next type is paracrine communication. And with paracrine communication, this means that the chemicals that are released are having an effect in a local area, so within the same tissue that they are released from. And we will look at examples of that later on as well. Autocrine communication occurs when cells secrete the chemicals, and they also have a local effect on the tissue that they're being released from. Example being prostaglandins that are secreted by smooth muscle and cause those other cells to contract within that smooth muscle. Now, true endocrine communication happens when the chemicals are released, as we said, are hormones, and they're transported through the blood to target cells. And the target cells can be far away from the point of origin of the hormones. For instance, from the pituitary gland, growth hormone is released, and then that growth hormone is released into the blood. It travels throughout the body to target tissues where growth is going to be occurring. So that's how hormones work, and that is what we mean by endocrine. So we're mostly going to focus on endocrine communication within this chapter. So I mentioned target cells, and target cells are the cells that are throughout the body that have receptors that can accept or read the chemical messengers. So not all cells of the body, for instance, are going to be able to respond to estrogen or testosterone. Only select cells that have the receptors are going to be able to respond to those hormones. Now, there's different types of hormones, just as there are different types of glands. And hormones, their different quantities can be released depending on what is needed within the body. There's different activities of enzymes and proteins within the target cells. Hormones can alter the metabolic activities of different types of tissues, and they can have long-term effect on the body as well, as we talked about with growth and development. Okay, the last type of intercellular communication is synaptic communication. And you should remember synaptic communication from when you studied the nervous system. So neurons are going to be releasing neurotransmitters at the synapse. So as you remember, the synapse is at the end of the axon where there is a space, and it's either going to be adjacent to a muscle or a gland or another neuron. So that's the synapse. And to go across that space, neurotransmitters are needed. So that leads to action potentials, which you remember what action potentials are when the ions begin to move into or out of the neuron, and that's propagated along the axons. So it allows for these messages to travel throughout a cell, a neuron, and is very important for control of the body. So just to go back just a second, these were all the intercellular communication methods. And again, the one that we're most going to be looking at within this chapter is back here in the endocrine communication. All right, so different types of hormones. So both the endocrine system and the nervous system uses hormones. Some of the neurotransmitters that we talked about in the nervous system are the same as the hormones that are used within the endocrine system. So there's this dual function there. So such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are not only neurotransmitters, but they're also hormones used within the endocrine system. And hopefully you remember negative feedback. So negative feedback mechanisms are the mechanisms that bring the condition back to a normal and stable level. So for instance, if you have too much estrogen that's being released, then a negative feedback mechanism would be able to detect that and bring the level of estrogen back to normal within a certain range. This preserves homeostasis by maintaining the body within a limit that is tolerable. So the endocrine system includes all endocrine cells and tissues that produce hormones and the paracrines. Okay, so you remember the paracrines have an effect in the immediate area. The endocrine cells release secretions into extracellular fluid, and you may remember some exocrine glands from the integumentary system. So the integumentary system, of course, is the skin, and some of the examples of the exocrine glands there would be sweat glands and sebaceous glands. Also, ceruminous glands are exocrine. So in contrast to that, so endocrine glands are releasing secretions into the blood and bodily fluids. So it goes from the cells into that fluid. Whereas exocrine glands are going to be releasing the secretions to the surface of the body, such as the skin, or through a tube or duct that would then lead to the surface of the body. So here we have a diagram that shows some of the endocrine organs and the hormones that they release. So you'll notice that a lot of times we abbreviate these hormones. For instance, oxytocin is OXT. It just makes it kind of easier to remember, and hopefully you will be able to get these abbreviations and the hormones that they go to. So this is a very important diagram that I want you to pay attention to and to really study this. Where are the endocrine organs and what hormones are they releasing? And then we're going to add to that eventually, and we're going to add to what's the effect of those hormones on the body. So those are the three important parts here within this section of the endocrine system. So we have the hypothalamus, which is found here in the brain. And the hypothalamus leads to the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is the regulator of the endocrine system. It is part of the nervous system as well as being part of the endocrine system. So it has that duality. The pituitary gland, which is also right there below the brain there, and it also has a function within the nervous system and the endocrine system. So you can see these hormones here that are being released. The hormones from the hypothalamus, many of them are going to go to stimulate the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is here, the pituitary gland is just under it. And the pituitary gland has two lobes. It has the anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And so you hopefully remember that anterior is towards the front and posterior is towards the back of the body. Also within the brain, we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland here is just under the corpus callosum there, and it is anterior to the cerebellum down here. So just in this area there. Then as we go down, we go below the brain here in the neck, we have the parathyroid glands, which are attached to the thyroid gland. So this whole thing here is the thyroid gland. And on the posterior surfaces of the thyroid gland, you have these basically four little dots, two on each side, that are the parathyroid glands. Right, and then also looking at the thyroid here, as I mentioned, the thyroid gland here, this is wrapped around the trachea. Right, and then as we go down, we have the adrenal glands, adrenal. Ad means above, renal referring to the kidney. So above the kidney, attached to the kidney there. Then we have the pancreas, which is also part of the digestive system, which we will see later on in the chapter, and it wraps basically under the stomach. Now over here on this side of the diagram, we have organs with secondary endocrine functions. So we have the heart. We know that the heart is part of the cardiovascular system, but it also has an endocrine function as well. And then we have the thymus, and don't confuse the thymus with the thyroid gland. So the thymus is inferior to the thyroid gland, and it is also in that proximity of the trachea there. It's shaped roughly like the thyroid gland, but the thing about the thymus is that it undergoes atrophy during adulthood. It gets smaller. And so this we'll talk about later on, but you develop your immune system, and the thymus is a great part of that development. And then as you get older, it gets smaller and smaller as the immune system it kind of slows down its development. You go down under the stomach here, and there's a little strip of adipose tissue here under the stomach, which also has some endocrine function. And then the digestive tract, it not only is involved with digestion, but also release of some hormones. Then we have the kidneys. So we talked about the adrenal glands there above the kidneys, but also the kidneys themselves are going to be releasing hormones as well. So we'll talk about them. And then as we go down, we have the gonads here, so the testes for a male, and we know that the testes are going to be releasing testosterone and other androgens. And then we have the ovaries, which are, as we've talked about already, releasing estrogen. So these organs here, we say they have secondary endocrine function. Their primary function would be the other systems that they are involved with. And you can see which chapters will be covering those later on. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and we will have another video for the different types of hormones.